Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for HI121. This is The Problem with the Noble Savage, Arminius, Tacitus, and the Germanic Legacy. So we are looking at another frontier today, and in this case it is the frontier in the north. So let's look at the status of it before the major battle that we're going to talk about today, which is the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. You might wonder why we're not looking to the eastern frontier, and the reason for that is that the eastern frontier is Rome's frontier with much more centralized states, and as a result they have an entirely different set of challenges. So we only have a limited amount of time, and plus I just like looking at barbarians. What can I say? They're more interesting to me. Now, the northern frontier is also quite challenging in some of the same ways the African frontier was. Augustus had been deeply interested in expanding his campaigning into Germanic territory from a very early date, possibly because he himself had had encounters with Germanic tribesmen in Gaul. After all, Julius Caesar had won his fame by conquering Gaul, so continuing to expand those boundaries may have seemed symbolically attractive to him as well. Now, in 16 BCE, a Germanic raiding party attacked and executed a contingent of Roman soldiers who were east of the Rhine. And then they crossed the line and attacked a cavalry unit. Pursuing them as they fled, they ran into the 5th Legion. They defeated it and captured the Eagle Standard. This was incredibly humiliating to the Roman soldiers, but it served as a really good excuse for military action. So Augustus took himself off to Gaul, organized new campaigns. The Germanic tribesmen realized that they had maybe just overstepped a tiny bit, crossed back into their homelands and sued for peace. Augustus's stepsons, Tiberius and Drusus, were the ones who took over the campaign. They defeated some of the Alpine tribes in the region between the Alps and the Danube. They expanded the fighting into the area around the middle and the lower Rhine as well, so they are pushing those boundaries outwards. So the issue here is that the frontier is not really clear-cut. By 12 BCE, there had actually been a number of Germanic tribesmen who had settled on the left bank of the Rhine. Some of them had done so with Roman approval. So it's more like a zone of interaction rather than a clear-cut frontier, and that makes things much more complicated. So the important thing is we're not looking at a signed and sealed conquest here. Germanic tribes also had no major centers to be attacked or defended. They were mobile, and they were much more difficult to defeat with Roman tactics. But within a few years, to southern eyes, they looked as though they'd been mostly pacified. And Augustus was a little bit sharper on the subject of integrating provincial territories politically and administratively. So after an uprising, he tried to get them to settle down, so there was no repeat performance. This was in Pannonia in 6 CE. So the Roman legate assigned to southern Germany, Publius Quintilius Verus, was assigned to look after this process of Romanization. He had a hard job. The tribes were resentful of Rome. According to some scholars, they were resentful because the taxes that were being levied had to be paid in metal. So Verus would lead his troops across the Rhine each spring. He would connect with the allied German cohorts, this is part of the treaties that had been made, and parade a little to show things off. He would also serve as an arbiter of local disputes along his route. It's likely that part of his job was creating Roman administrative structures, so doing things like taking the census, arranging for taxation. A lot of our sources sort of scorn him for doing that. To be fair, he's not incompetent. They like to paint him as incompetent, but he certainly didn't really understand what was actually going on in this area. It seems likely that Rome as a whole was probably feeling a little cocky about the north being pacified. Possibly they had also underestimated the tribes, feeling that they were inferior militarily, and that this wasn't likely to be a continuing threat. And as usual, what did they do? They wound up creating their own rebel leader. So Arminius was the prince of the Cherusci tribe. He had commanded German auxiliary troops for Rome, and he was rewarded with Roman citizenship. So he was obviously very well versed in Roman ways of war. He had generally been seen by Roman writers as a talented, brave young man of noble birth. Few of the contemporary writers would have known him personally. He served as the commander of a Cherusci cohort and got friendly with Varus that last summer before the battle. But he had an ongoing feud with another king, Segestes, of the Chatti. He was a Roman ally, and he warned Varus apparently several times that Arminius was plotting something. What was he plotting? Well, he apparently had actually taken leadership of those planning a revolt, although his role was a carefully kept secret. He needed to be on good terms with Rome to help set everything up. Now, Varus didn't believe Segestes because he assumed that it had to do with Arminius having eloped with the older king's daughter, which he actually did. And Arminius's father had also okayed the wedding, so that was a direct insult to the Chatti. So Varus is right. There is reason for Segestes to make Arminius look bad. We're told that Varus headed back towards the Rhine to go to his winter quarters. Arminius didn't go with him. Supposedly he was put in chains by Segestes, but then freed by his tribesmen, who put Segestes in chains. I always found that so fascinating. All we really know about this type of interaction is from Roman sources, and of course they knew relatively little about what sort of internal unrest the tribes were going through. This kind of hazy view of factional fighting does remind us that these people had politics just as complex and fraught as Rome, but we're only seeing glimpses of it. Now, eventually, word comes to Varus of an uprising amongst tribes to the north. He heads up there, and the Germanic auxiliaries who are accompanying him basically asked to be excused so that they could gather reinforcements. Perfectly logical request. Problem, of course, is that they're asking to be excused so that they can go off and join the rebels. Varus, however, had 3 legions. This is somewhere between 15,000 and 18,000 men. This would have included cavalry. They would have been accompanied by family members and camp followers. Arminius, meanwhile, had pulled together strategic tribes. He had avoided those who had particularly close ties to Rome. They killed the Roman troops quartered at the settlements and then headed off to the rendezvous point. Now, Germanic tribal kings who were seen to be potential supporters of the Romans, we are told, were captured and put in chains. So it's obvious that this confederation of his was a bit tenuous from the get-go. And some sources actually claim that Varus received a message from Arminius urging him to follow up on the report of the uprising. You can kind of imagine it, right? Oh, my friend, you need to go and look after this. This is terrible. And of course, he had no reason at that point to doubt Arminius. All right. The actual site of the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, this is in 9 CE. Somehow I missed putting that on the slides. The site's been disputed. There is a site at Kolkries in the northern Weser Hills, which is suggestive because of the nature of it, plus some of the archaeological remains. It isn't where the great statue of Arminius is, but frankly, for the sake of legend, that doesn't really matter. What we're told is that when the legions were finally attacked in the ambush, the column was strung out over a significant distance in the forest, so they literally marched right into it. The tribesmen were somewhere between 20,000 and 30,000 in number. They had the high ground, and they had them backed up against marshes. The terrain is too difficult for usual Roman tactics. They couldn't deploy their cavalry, and because of the roughness of the ground, the infantry couldn't manage its usual formations. The battle was a long one. It lasted several days. Varus tried to create temporary fortifications and to get word out to call for reinforcements from the Rhine, but his messengers were intercepted. We're told he tried to make a break for it and couldn't manage to lead his army out on the march. And they took such heavy casualties that they came back to the temporary defenses. Now, in the end, the legions are slaughtered. Only a handful of soldiers escape. Varus and the officers commit suicide, and supposedly the tribesmen kill every prisoner they take, supposedly via human sacrifice, but again, we've got to take into account the source for such stories. There is a fairly awful story that we're told about one soldier seeing what was going to happen to them, bashing his own head in with his shackles. Arminius sent Varus's head to a fellow tribal king, who sent it on to Augustus in Rome, who allowed it to be interred in the family vault. Now, this was not some great triumphant victory for particularly long. Arminius is not able to follow up successfully. He couldn't keep his coalition together because the tribes were quarreling amongst themselves. The only reason he lived as long as he did is that Rome didn't follow up immediately either. The two remaining legions in Germania made a run for the Rhine and held the line there. They had actually lost 10% of their entire military force. That's 3 of 28 legions. They didn't have many options at that point. Our sources tell us that Augustus disbanded his Germanic bodyguards, saying they couldn't be trusted, and that when he got the news, he cried out, "Varus, give me back my legions." There might have actually been some real fear that they would try and march south, the tribesmen. Either way, it's the temporary end of Roman expansion that far north. The boundary becomes fixed at the Rhine and the Danube, effectively. It was just simply too costly at that point to try and force it any further north. Augustus had to reevaluate what was it going to take to garrison the territory that they had. He reintroduced conscription, and he used it to create new levies that would augment the legions. Tiberius, his stepson, conducted punitive operations. In 10 to 12 CE, Germanicus would go on to campaign there with 4 legions a few years later, but these are not attempts at conquest or occupation. Germanicus in particular was looking for the legionary eagles and the bones of Varus's men. He did take some valuable prisoners, including other chiefs and Arminius' wife, but he hadn't won anything decisively. In the end, Arminius is murdered in a family quarrel, and the other big threat, Maroboduus, is expelled by his people and took refuge in Rome. Rome is then able to keep the tribes under close watch and manipulate the election of pro-Roman chiefs. So Tiberius famously regarded Germania as having been, quote, triumphed over, not conquered. He preferred to use diplomacy, but he always saw them as a continuing threat. And Rome's problem here, again, always, is that they felt they had more control than they did. They didn't give sufficient attention to the political dynamics of the area. They tried to take a one-size-fits-all approach, and that doesn't necessarily work. If, culturally speaking, a conquered group is not interested in becoming Roman, you're going to always have problems with them if you can't convince them otherwise. They also essentially incubated their own problem, just like in North Africa. Roman-trained barbarians were a real issue and continued to be so. This is obviously not the end of the story of the Germanic people's difficult relationship with Rome. This early encounter shapes the later relationship. It pushes Rome into making certain specific choices, turning would-be Germanic settlers into federati, federated troops, and using them to defend the borders. They never do manage to fully Romanize the northern barbarians. Many of the Germanic peoples do see great value in certain aspects of Roman culture and law, but what they do is they cherry-pick what they like, and they still maintain their own distinct identity. And that is a problem that never goes away. I just want to stress that, what I've just given you is a very Roman-centric view of all of this. We simply do not see the other side as clearly. Even with some of these figures being at least semi-integrated into Roman society, their voices don't come through clearly. The only reason we know as much about the battle as we do is that some of the survivors testified at an inquest into the events. So, of course, that is the Roman perspective on the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest. When you look at Rome's collision with its neighbors on its frontiers, it is always kind of looking at the collision of two worlds, only one of which we ever see clearly. I think I've mentioned that my original research background was in the so-called barbarian peoples. And the reason for that is that they're fascinating. You get glimpses of an incredibly complex society. Maybe they weren't writing like the Romans were writing. That doesn't make them as primitive as they've been depicted by the Romans. The effort to try and sort of sidestep those implicit biases. It's a real intellectual puzzle, and it's one that always intrigued me. Now, to wrap things up today, I want to move forward a little into the 1st century. I'm going to talk about a book. So, one of the things that emerged from the post-Teutoburg context is an interest in understanding the Germanic peoples. And one of the examples of someone who tried to do this was the writer Tacitus towards the end of the 1st century. He created a text that has actually had a very disproportionate effect on later history. The Germania is basically an ethnographic work. The difficult thing is that we don't actually know what it was meant to accomplish. There is no other text quite like it from the late Roman period. What was its purpose? Is it one of a kind? Or has it just been the only one of its type that happened to survive? Some scholars think it's basically a set of research notes for Tacitus's later work, the Histories. It's been also interpreted as a political treatise, as a piece of proto-anthropology, as a moral treatise. Some people think he hated the Germanic peoples, but others thought he actually really was fascinated by them. Some think that this is just propaganda and it was written to justify the Emperor Trajan staying on the Roman side of the frontier, whereas others say, no, he's actually trying to justify the conquest of Germania. There is no preface or dedication that could fill us in as to what Tacitus intended with this book. Now, if it's true that it was written in 98 CE, which is about as precise as we can get, it's interesting that it was written at a time when the empire was busy wondering what did Trajan intend to do, because he was sitting on the Rhine frontier at the time. Now, Tacitus presents all of the information about the Germanic peoples as if it's unbiased and objective. He creates it as sort of a senator's report, and that affects how we read it, even though we know it has biases. He actually had served for a time as a governor near the Germanic frontier, so he was seen as qualified to talk about these people. And this apparently objective approach he takes, it can hide a lot. If he presents it as simple information, the emperor and everyone else should know, and yet he couches it in a particular way, he's manipulating his readers to think in a particular way about these people. And as I said, a lot of scholars have interpreted this to mean he's, an imperialist who's trying to encourage northward conquest. The Germania is lost for most of the Middle Ages. Its single copy was found in Hersfeld Abbey in 1425, brought to Italy and given to the Pope, who was thankfully nice enough to share it, or perhaps not thankfully nice enough to share it with the German humanists. So what happens is that it spurs an interest in the distant Germanic past. And over time, with the development of Romanticism, this book kind of gets hooked into that in a way that's really not a good thing. His discussion of the nature of Germanic kingship fits the Romantic context way too well. It sort of plays into this idea, especially in the 19th century, of Germanic racial chauvinism. They are just simply a better breed. And they're pulling directly on Tacitus when they say things like that. The Nazis loved Tacitus. They used him to descend even further into these horrible ideals, and we all know how that ended up. Their belief, based on Tacitus, was that primal Germanic culture was moral, it was pure, it was warrior-like, they were bound to the land. Basically, they tied the concept of political development to the concept of race. And Tacitus helped them do it. So I called this slide A Most Dangerous Book. That's actually the title of a book on Tacitus and the Germania, which is absolutely fascinating. One of these days I will probably assign it as a book review title in this class, but it's a little bit harder, which is one of the reasons I've refrained as often as I have. But this is all, the Teutoburg Forest and Arminius, Tacitus and the Germania, and it all connects to each other. Think about 18th and 19th century German historians, them looking back at the late Roman period. They don't want to be seen as the descendants of those who destroyed the Roman Empire, and rightfully so, because the quote-unquote barbarian invasions did not destroy the Roman Empire. But if you're going to push back against that, you need to have a different interpretation of these people, your ancestors. And something like Tacitus provides that. Instead of depicting them as the wreckers of Roman Europe, you can depict them as the noble savage, the ones who are not corrupt and decadent, the true warrior culture of Northern Europe. And that's not going to lead anywhere good in the end. Okay, thanks very much, guys. That will do it for this week. And I will look forward to seeing you at the Zoom session on Tuesday. Have a really great weekend.